What's going on, AP World Historians? This is your AP World History teacher, Ben Osborne. Happy to be here with you today on a topic of particular interest to me, which is Africa. I don't know about you, but whenever I have learned things about history, it seems like Africa in particular is one that is sort of left off of the books. I think there's a couple different reasons for this. Western society, particularly America, for so long has been fairly racist. That's also true of Europe as well. So I think there was a sort of an assumption that African history was not always particularly important and therefore shouldn't be studied. So I think we're in the past 50 or 60 years, ever since the Civil Rights Movement, we're starting to see a lot of change in that way. Like we're starting to see more information out there, more historians and others working on parts of Africa and trying to understand it a little bit better. One of the other things about it is that I think sometimes people think that there is not, even if Africa was important, it doesn't have as many connections to our history in America or our history in Europe, but that is also not the case, as we'll take a little bit of a look today, but just sort of in general for it. And the thing about it is that the African peoples didn't generally write a lot of historical works. Primarily their history is going to be traveled through a group of people that I believe is pronounced griots. It's spelled like griots. So they had a largely oral tradition of history, not a tradition that is written down as much. So there's some problems along the way with trying to get some of that information as well. But like I said, luckily in the past 50, 60, 70 years, we've started to see a lot of change there. We're starting to see people realize just how important Africa is in so many different ways to our history, and we are the luckier for it, that's for sure. So let's take a look here a little bit at Africa. This is around the 1200s or so. This time period is going to kind of stretch a little bit over that 1200. So we're going to be in 1000 to 1200 to 1300, kind of in that general area there, as we look at some of the statecraft and some of the states and things like that are there. First off, starting off, if we're taking a look at Africa sort of in general, it's super important for you to realize and understand that Africa is an incredibly diverse place. Much like Native Americans or, lots of other places around the world, it's very difficult for us to just simply say, oh, that is an African, or this person has African beliefs or whatever. That Africa is not like one thing. It's not monolithic. In fact, it has a lot of different ethnic groups, languages, concepts, religions. It's incredibly and intensely diverse. Same thing also holds true for Native American groups, particularly in America. So when you talk about Native American groups, like Iroquois or Sioux or whatever. I mean, these groups are incredibly diverse and different from each other. So when we talk about Africa here, and when we're not talking about specific groups, like we'll talk here, as you'll see, about Ghana and Mali, when we're talking sort of in a general sense, it's important to understand that these are very high-level things, right? Like, we can say things about Europe that European languages are, Latin-based or German-based or something. That's a very high-level thing, but it doesn't really get down into the core and the differences between those different things. So when we're looking at Africa, we're going to have the same situation. A couple things here that we can see for their political systems is that they generally are going to have this sort of kin-based network with chiefs, and that is the original system that will change, however, over time. So unlike in European areas where you had a specific family that would kind of go through places, or maybe you would have a specific territory or place, in Africa, generally speaking, the types of kingdoms and things were organized more around people and their allegiance to an individual leader, as opposed to just saying, okay, I own this little space here and you own that little space over there. That's not something that works quite as well within the African system. So what you would have then is you would have groups of families. You would have large groups of families. So you and your family may belong to a clan, and that clan then is going to belong to a larger clan, and then that group goes all the way up until you end up with these sort of large groups of people that are going to form these kin-based networks. And at the very top of that kin-based network, then, we will have a chief. And those chiefs can be selected in a lot of different ways, but those chiefs are going to be sort of the king, in a sense, of this large group. And these kin-based networks can be gigantic, like they can be very, very large. So don't think that they're, we think of chiefs, we think of small bands or groups, but in reality, this is going to be a very, very large group of people. However, over time, we're going to see increased populations. There's going to be a need for some more organized kingdoms, in particular for things like trade. And so we're going to start to see these sort of like not really primarily kind of Western ideas of kingship, but we're going to start to see much more organized states, like groups of people taking on sort of more organized concepts and organized statecraft in a way. One of our examples here is Hausa. It is a part of that Trans-Saharan Trade Network. We're going to learn a lot more about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network later, but it is exactly what it sounds like, which is a trade network that went across the Sahara. So that group then actually needed to do things to control the trade on that network. So they ended up becoming more organized over time and changing a bit of their structure in order to keep that going. So in the Western Sudan then, Ghana and Mali are going to dominate trade. Let's talk about what the Western Sudan is, though. So today, if you hear Sudan, you're going to think of the country, or South Sudan, which is the southern part of that country. Anywhere basically from modern-day Mali all the way over to the Sudan, that sort of general area is known as the Sudan. It's the place right below the Sahara Desert. It's also called the Sahel region, which is like a transitional region between those areas. But that's sort of like upper, like northern part of Africa, not quite to the Mediterranean, but sort of in that general area there is going to be called the Sudan. So the Western Sudan would then make up modern-day countries like Mali or Burkina Faso or places like that. So that's kind of the general area that we're talking about. We'll see a map in a second that'll make a little bit more sense. But in those places then, we're going to have a couple of different kingdoms that are going to come through. So for example, we have Ghana, Mali, Songhai will come a little bit later on. These kingdoms are all basically based around the same location or area, but they are changes in, say, like one town taking over and becoming more important, or a family changing and taking over and becoming more important over time. So Ghana, for example, will be formed very, very early, but then gradually over time, it will sort of fade, and then we will have the power will shift to another city with another group, and then it will reform itself as Mali over time. You could kind of think of this as like maybe like Germany in Europe, how it sort of is like a bunch of princely states, then it's the Holy Roman Kingdom, then it's Germany proper, and now then it's like East Germany and West Germany, and now it's like Germany today. Like it sort of reforms itself over time, and there's going to be different leaders and different groups, and they will call themselves different things. It's an imprecise, don't think it's exactly that, it's an imprecise analogy, but it's just an analogy to some Western things that you may be a little bit more familiar with. The point is that this one area then is going to have a lot of power over the Niger River, and it will sort of change gradually over time. We end up having these Ghana and Mali kind of states. They're Islamic states, so Islam will come into this area across the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, and they will end up having very centralized areas, centralized authorities. Trading in the Trans-Saharan route is going to make them extremely rich, and gradually, as I said before, Mali will replace Ghana, and from that then we will end up getting the Lion King, Sundiata, who will establish Mali. He will be the founder of that dynasty, and a little bit later on then, one of his ancestors then is going to be Mansa Musa, who was probably one of the most important of all the African kings. Probably he is the richest person probably in human history. He, as the leader of Mali, had enormous like gold mines and things, and they were incredibly, incredibly rich through trade. Supposedly, the story goes that when he did his Hajj trip to Mecca, along the way, he spent so much gold that he ended up basically devaluing gold all the way across the entire area. So I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's the story, but it is kind of an interesting one regardless. So these leaders then are going to be leaders of incredibly powerful organizations. Now, if we go a little bit further south then in Southeast Africa, this will be the modern day countries of, say, Mozambique or Zimbabwe, maybe all the way up to Kenya. We're going to have these things called Zimbabwe's, which were dwellings. They're places to live. So in that case then, we'll have this thing known as, over here, Great Zimbabwe. Okay, so Great Zimbabwe, we call it this culture today. I don't think we know 100% what it actually called itself, but this was an enormous dwelling that was basically a city that had these gigantic walls that were built around it. So it's a culture that established trade with gold, agriculture, and grazing. Essentially what they would do is they would trade to the coastal cities of the Swahili coast, such as Kilwa, and in the process then they would trade sort of the inner kind of African supplies like, ivory and, gold and things, and they would trade it to the coasts, and the coast would then trade that on to other groups instead. As mentioned, that Great Zimbabwe was this massive stone fortification, and it still exists today, so you can still go check it out. All right, just a little map here for you. Okay, this friend right here is going to be Sundiata, the Lion King, and then you can see up there that Mali Empire over time. So if you look at that blue river that's flowing through there, you can see just behind his head there is Niger, the Niger River. That river goes all the way basically through the desert. It starts in the hills and areas over there. I think that's that's the Côte d'Ivoire that's over there, or Liberia. Or Sierra Leone. It starts in that kind of area, and then it's going to travel up through modern-day Mali, and then it will come back down again through Nigeria. So that area then is great for trade. There's like water in that area to grow food, and so it becomes a very central, powerful place there in Western Africa. Also, if you notice, Timbuktu is almost halfway to the north, to the river, to the Mediterranean Sea. So they are also in a great spot for doing transport for trade up through Timbuktu to get into trade across the Mediterranean region as well. So these cities are very important. Gen, Timbuktu, and Gao. They will sort of change over time as to which ones are going to be more powerful than the others. So for example, during Ghana's reign, one of them will be more powerful than the other, but they're all still pretty powerful over time. Okay. This is going to be Great Zimbabwe here. Oh, look, I'm inside. I'm in the little thing here. So this is Great Zimbabwe. You can see it over there from the sky. It's a big, huge wall that sort of wraps around. What's really neat about it, as you can tell from this section that's right here behind my head, the walls are extremely narrow. So what happens then is that when attackers would come, they would sort of be like channeled into this area, and so you could have soldiers up on the top over here that could like fire down on them or stab down at them to help prevent them from getting in. So it's a very, very important place. This would be sort of more like the palace as opposed to the city. So if you see, there's like other little structures and stuff that are outside of it, and little kind of roads and things around the structure. Probably would have been a lot of other people living, and this would have been sort of the main sort of citadel in a sense area there in southern Africa. One little factoid for you: when Europeans were exploring in this area and they found this place, they kept looking for white people because they were so racist that they just could not believe that black Africans could create these things. So they kept looking for some sort of like famous, like lost white tribe or something like that. Just goes to show you just how racist Europeans could be back in those days, and that they were unable to accept what is clearly before their eyes, which is that the people living there were the ones who had built it. All right, continuing on here then, let's go a little bit farther up. We're kind of bouncing all around the continent here. Let's take a look here. Ethiopia, modern-day country. It's right over there on the Horn of Africa, very close to the Red Sea. It's a modern-day country, but it's been around for a very long time, interestingly. So a long time ago, and about in Roman times, we have an empire known as Aksum that existed there. But by about the 1100s, a new Christian empire had emerged. What's unique about Ethiopia is that it's able to fend off Islam. So Islamic like invasions as well as Islamic converts were going on all throughout Africa, but either through the strength of their religion or through the strength of arms, they were able to prevent Muslims from being able to control them. So they end up creating a unique form of Christianity that is very different from the Christianity in lots of parts of the West. One of the cool things they do is they build these massive rock churches. We'll show you a picture of those in a second that are really cool. And it's very different, again, due to that isolation that it has. It's sort of cut off from Western Christianity, so the beliefs and sort of structures and things they have are slightly different. Now, in addition to these kin systems that you find in Africa, age sets were often made to work. Men did work sort of associated with special skills, and women tend to do more agriculture and general labor. So there's a slightly different sort of division between this and, say, like Western European areas. Men, again, are generally going to be like soldiers and things, but when it comes down to special skills like certain types of planting of crops or building things or other stuff like that, that's the thing that men did, and women are going to sort of do the more generalized stuff. Now, slavery, always wrong, obviously. A terrible, horrible thing about human history. Almost every culture in human history had slaves of some sort. So we talked before about the Aztecs. They had slaves. East Asia does not really have a lot of slaves by this time period, but early on in Chinese history, there were slaves as well. And there's also lots of other examples. I mean, and, you know, the definition of slave also being sort of a debatable thing there. But in this case, then, it's always wrong and always terrible. But this sort of slavery that we have here in Africa was common, but it's a little less harsh in a sense. I'll show you a little image in a second that'll describe this a little bit. But generally speaking, it's important for us as historians to recognize the differences between what is called chattel slavery versus other types of slavery. Chattel slavery is what you think of when you think of slavery in America. So we have African people who are enslaved. They are enslaved on the basis of their skin color. They are owned by human beings. They are considered to be property. Their children are born into slavery, etc., etc. It is an incredibly harsh form of slavery. In lots of other places around the world, though, slavery was not quite as detrimental in some ways. So, for example, like in ancient Mesopotamia, you could actually sell yourself into slavery for a period of time to get rid of your debts. The Romans had slaves as well, but they oftentimes were sort of like house servants, and they could even potentially buy their freedom. So there's a lot of different levels as to what that means. In Africa proper, the slavery that they had tended to be more like that sort of Roman style. Typically speaking, slaves were usually like caught in combat or in battles, or maybe it was based upon debt issues. And the person would oftentimes sort of serve in the household of the individual over a period of time. Again, it doesn't make it right, but it does make it a little bit of a nuanced position on some of the types. So one other example here is that there's an Indian Ocean slave trade that is being carried on by Arabic traders. So Zanj were the nicknames that they gave the slaves from in the Arabic world. So black slaves, African slaves, would have been called Zanj. And they were typically given sort of a variety of different jobs. Women were oftentimes brought for concubines, whereas men oftentimes did like very harsh labor, like if they were working in like tough agricultural conditions or mining, things like that. The Zanj Rebellion is an example of the resistance that these groups had against it. It was in modern-day Iraq in a very successful slave revolt. They were able to hold off the forces of their owners for quite a period of time. So pretty impressive. Couple pictures here for you then. So here we see comparing the three forms of slavery here. So chattel, again, is the thing that we're talking about for America. In chattel slavery, slaves are the legal property of the owner. Americas in the 16th and 19th century, enslavement is permanent. Children of slaves were slaves, and slaves had no rights. Now, if we look at other examples of this, so domestic slaves versus debt bondage, we can see it's slightly different, right? So description of domestic slaves served as cooks, cleaners, and household workers. And debt bondage, they sometimes, through mutual agreement, would repay that debt. So it's kind of like that Mesopotamian thing I mentioned. We have examples here in Greece and Rome. That would be that domestic version, etc. What's really interesting, though, is these other things down here. So enslavement permanent and domestic, often it could be. And in debt bondage, not in theory, although many slaves never regain their freedom. And then we also see children of slaves automatically slaves. So yes, in chattel, but in domestic and debt bondage, it could change a little bit. And so, again, these are not nice things. These are not good things that we want to have. Slavery is wrong, but it's important to recognize that nuance between it. All right, so African arts were varied and were an important part of life. Music also in very rhythmic patterns and use what we might call percussion. Part of that has to do a little bit with what we're about to talk about here, which is visual arts are also incredibly important. But they're primarily going to be sculpture. So in warm and moist environments, like we think about in parts of West Africa or like the savanna or sort of jungle areas of Zaire, those things like paints or alternately certain types of instruments that rely upon strings don't work as well. Like there's a lot of humidity there. So that's a little bit of a problem. So what we tend to find then is, again, that rhythmic percussion is an important factor, as well as metal sculpture and masks, because they were like, physical forms of art. Both are also very much a part of a generalized African traditional religion that includes ancestor veneration. So again, Islam is coming in here, and also everybody's religion is quite different in Africa. But one thing we tend to see in a lot of African traditional religions is this ancestor veneration concept. It's important because people could use the sculpture to ask ancestors for help, for example, or alternately the masks could be used to assume the form of those gods. So we have a lot of examples where people basically are taking on the role of that god. They'll dress up in the outfit, they'll put the mask on, and then they will, for the people who are there as well as the individual who's doing that, they are that god for that purpose, and therefore they can discuss it and work on that and be involved in people's lives. One thing, again, we mentioned at the very top is that telling stories, like history, is extremely important. But again, they don't really tend to write it down as much. So we end up having these groups that I've heard pronounced griots. If I mispronounce that, I apologize. But they are also very important. There were men and also there were women versions of these that were basically like storytellers. They were important people in the community. They were actually feared by a lot of like leaders and stuff, because if the griot forms a really ugly story about you, you're not going to be remembered well in your death. So it's important that you treat the griots pretty well, because otherwise you could have some very difficult problems. All right, just a couple pictures here to kind of give an example of that. So these are actually from the Birmingham Museum of Art, which is kind of cool. It's a local kind of affair there. This thing over on the left is a mask, and it is huge and very heavy. I mean, I've never picked it up, but if you go to the museum, you can see just how big this thing is. But essentially the bottom part down there, where you can see the sort of eyes that are on there, if you put that helmet on then, it would sort of be strapped down underneath your chin, and the top part would also be on the top as well. And it's going to represent that god. On the right then, you'll see an example of sort of a statue that would be for worship as well. So this may be like an ancestor or important god that would end up helping you out, and that you could ask for issues or other problems that you have. All right, folks, that is a brief description of Africa around the 1200s or so, at the beginning of our time period. We'll talk more about a lot of this stuff when we talk about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, as well as some other issues. I hope you learned a bit, and thank you so much for sticking with me, and I will talk to you all next time.